Thank you very much. And this is nice to see this turnout here. I want to talk a little bit about Curtiz and a little bit about Casablanca, obviously. But first, I'd like to thank Paul and UCLA for allowing me to curate this series and for putting it on. Also, KJ Reith, who went out and got all of these movies, Todd Weiner, in addition. And programming this festival was kind of like a microcosm of writing this book, because originally I had intended to spend 3 years and write about a 350-page book, and that turned into 7 years and 700 pages. And more than once during the process, I recalled that line that John Eustace spoke to Jack Nicholson in Chinatown, where he says, "You may think you know what you're dealing with, but believe me, you don't." It was really tough, and it was really tough to program this festival. There were a lot of hard choices to make. 21 films out of a resume of I stopped counting at like 181, and that includes some of the films that he didn't finish, that he left unfinished in Europe, and that he did partially at Warner Brothers and so forth. I'd also like to thank the good people at Warner Brothers who provided many of the films here, and that's Christy Nakamura, Ned Price, and one of my heroes, George Feltenstein, who his work with the Warner Archive, a lot of these films really wouldn't exist, so kudos to George. And by the way, I'll be doing something at the Burbank Library, I think on January 17th. They have this big display of the 75th anniversary of Casablanca, if you can't get enough of it, and George and I are going to be there together talking about Casablanca, and I'll be signing books as well. So, Curtiz, 181 films, 94 of them for Warner Brothers. Peter Lorre said about Curtiz, Curtiz eats movies and excretes movies. I put in the book it was an incandescent mania for filmmaking. What Curtiz said about his technique for making films is you should be a tiger on the camera fighting for the success of the movie. And no other director is really more firmly identified with the branded success of a single American movie studio than Michael Curtiz. Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy, Mildred Pierce, Robin Hood, The Seawolf, Angels with Dirty Faces, Life with Father, White Christmas, The Breaking Point, really the richest of cinematic legacies. And what I found about Curtiz, one of the many things I discovered about him, he was largely ignored and has been largely ignored by historians because he was an exception to the auteur theory. He really was a man for all movies. And really, I have to say that when you take, for those slavish adherents to the auteur theory, don't be offended, don't take it personally, but when you take the auteur theory and you try to apply it unilaterally to films made in Hollywood during the 1930s and the 1940s, it really doesn't work. Also, Curtiz died in 1962, and this was before the wave of retrospective appreciation for Golden Age directors and the work done by Richard Schickel and Peter Bogdanovich and so on and so forth, and all of those documentaries. So Curtiz died before that. So he was really kind of considered a vocational mechanic of the studio system, a guy that, hey, give me the script and I'll shoot the script. And as I found out doing the research for this book, nothing could be further than the truth. He rewrote scenes, he changed scripts. He was in a constant state of acrimony with people like Jack Warner and Hal Wallace and early on Zanuck, because he insisted on making movies in his own way, and most of the time improving them. Very interesting. Of course, during his career, he was very well known not only for his hit films, but his English malapropisms that got literally had his name applied as a descriptive noun called Curtizisms. You know, next time I need a dumb son of a bitch, I'll send for myself. Of all the Hungarians, I speak the best goddamn English. He had an explosive temper. He was not a sadist in the true sense of that word, but he had a short fuse and he vented pressure. He did pick on people like the sound guy. He hated sound people because when they came in, he made his first film in 1912. And when sound came in, he came to Warner Brothers in 26, and the sound people from Western Electric basically took authority of the set with their technology and newfangled things. So he always used the sound people, the sound guy, as kind of a verbal piñata. He was a paradoxical man. Of the many people that didn't like him, there were those that did like him very much. Ann Blythe, who I interviewed extensively, adored him and was a close friend. Doris Day, John Garfield. And I think the best way to sum up Curtiz's personality was a quote from Hal Moore to Leonard Maltin. And Hal Moore was the pioneer cinematographer that shot many of Curtiz's early films, also shot The Jazz Singer. And he said, I enjoyed Mike very much. He was a brutal son of a bitch. He had no consideration for anybody's feelings, but he was really a very kindly man. So go figure. Curtiz's talent was prodigious. He had an instinct for film. William Dieterle, who was an actor who became a directorial colleague, said, you know, if people were late at Warner Brothers and directors were not on time, not on schedule, they usually replaced him with Curtiz, and he could do anything. And Dieterle said, if I didn't have my script and it was being rewritten or something, I was helpless. He said, but Curtiz had such like this Jungian instinct for film. He could function without a script and move ahead and get things done. Robert Buckner, the producer who produced Yankee Doodle Dandy, Life with Father, and many of Curtiz's films, he said Curtiz could make a film and he didn't even really know what it was about while he was making it. When he made Mission to Moscow, he said I had to constantly remind him of the events that were going on with the war and what we were doing. Jimmy Lydon, who was in Life with Father and had a long, long career both in front of and mostly behind the camera, said, he told me Mike was really an artistic man, and he arranged every setup he ever shot. He said the cinematographer, the cameraman did not arrange the setups. Mike arranged the setups, and it was never just a two-shot. It was very, very artistic in how he used the camera. His arrival at Warner Brothers in 1926 after directing upwards of 70 films in Europe was really serendipitous because I think Warner Brothers was the right studio at the right time. They were the survivors. They were coming out of basically making their mark. Sound was coming in, and then shortly thereafter, The Jazz Singer, and then Warner Brothers acquired First National, and that was how they got from Sunset Boulevard up to Burbank. And so the founders of Warner Brothers and the pictures that they produced over the next 2 decades had a decidedly sharp, edgy quality that really dovetailed with Curtiz's vitality and this superhuman work ethic he had. In writing this book, it was impossible not to write a lot about Warner Brothers and not to write a lot about the Warners themselves. This was a studio that reflected the personality of the brothers, particularly Harry, Sam, who died in 1927, but was really the glue that held the brothers together in the formative years, and of course, the one and only Jack L. Warner. It was really the only major Hollywood studio that was run by a family, like a family business. And that kind of brings me to Casablanca, which Paul had said it's the most beloved film ever. I think it's the most beloved and the most chronicled. How does one write something new or say something new about Casablanca that hasn't been uttered or written? There's several great books. Olagine Harmetz's book, I think Round Up the Usual Suspects, and has been reissued, maybe one of the great books ever written about a single movie. My colleague Noah Eisenberg has a new book out on Casablanca. And there's a multitude of memoirs by the people who wrote it and interviews, and what I concluded and what I wrote in my book was that long afterward, everyone wanted to be the first one to claim that I went to Rick's and had something to do with the making of Casablanca. I tried to write about Casablanca from Curtiz's perspective, as in what did he do, because Casablanca and all of these movies from that era, and still today, obviously, are a collaborative exercise. So what did Curtiz do for Casablanca? By the way, I just have to ask this question. Is there anyone here who has not seen Casablanca? Is there anyone here? One? I envy you, young lady. And you, sir, so there's 2. Okay. this is going to be a seminal experience for you. You'll remember it the rest of your life. But what did Curtiz do that helped make Casablanca such a great picture? He cast all the European bit players. And when you see particularly the opening shot where there's a dolly shot through ricks and the bustle of everyone moving around, and then they go to each table and everyone's trying to make a deal to get a black market passport and get out of Casablanca, many of those actors were Jewish refugees from Europe, and Curtiz cast all of them. And in fact, the one major scene where the French national anthem is sung, those tears were not phony. They were authentic. The dolly shots, the flashbacks, Curtiz also insisted that the love story between Elsa and Rick be built up so all the things that happened in the present made sense. He basically forced Hal Wallis to cast Dooley Wilson as Sam. Wallis wanted to use Clarence Muse. Curtiz didn't like him. He thought Dooley Wilson was better, and he was right. He also took his old Hungarian friend, S.Z. Cuddles Zakal, and cast him as Carl, and they had a big set-to with Wallis over, well, he wants 4 weeks and 1,500. You have to get him 3 weeks and 1,200. And Curtiz basically acted as the middleman between Hal Wallis, the producer, and he got Carl, or rather Zakal, cast in the film, and then built up his part because he perceived that Zakal's humor was important to leaving out the story and so forth. The other thing about Casablanca, I think that I should mention is it's kind of like Curtiz coming to Warner Brothers in 1926. It's a matter of timing. So the first day of production in Casablanca, May 25th, 1942, the first major studio in Hollywood that recognized the threat of Nazism was Warner Brothers. And particularly Harry Warner was a very, very serious American patriot who coined the studio's motto, combining good citizenship with good picture making. And Warner's produced anti-Nazi pictures such as Confessions of a Nazi Spy and Underground well before December 1941 and Pearl Harbor that brought America into the war. And so there were many war-themed films that were produced that year. Desperate Journey, Across the Pacific, Watch on the Rhine, Air Force, etc. in 1942 and 1943. And all of these films were produced by Hal Wallis for Warner Brothers and highly successful, but they also rallied audiences to the cause. Of course, Wallis had purchased a play called Everybody Comes to Rick in 1941. And contrary to a lot of things that have been written, the play that was written by Murray Burnett and Joan Allison really forms the spine of the movie. There's a lot of the play in the movie. And of all the folklore that surrounds the making of Casablanca, the question of which writer or writers deserve the lion's share of the credit, that's like throwing a huge jigsaw puzzle up in the air and then you're picking up the pieces. But really, it was primarily the product of Howard Koch and the Epstein brothers, Julius and Phil Epstein. And the Epsteins were very interesting. They were identical twins who were terrific wits, and their fingerprints are all over the great dialogue that you'll hear in Casablanca. They also loved poking fun at Jack Warner, and Warner believed writers should punch a time clock and work an 8-hour day and come in the studio. And he said, because as Warner put it, you guys are like railroad executives or bank presidents. You have to work an 8-hour day. So the Epstein sent Warner an unfinished script one time with a note on it that said, "Dear Jack, please have the bank president finish this for us." Of course, you had Humphrey Bogart, who had really paid a lot of dues for years playing heavies and became a contracted player at Warner's in 1935. And he finally crested the summit with High Sierra and the Maltese Falcon. Those pictures made Bogart a star, but Casablanca really made Humphrey Bogart immortal. He was matched by Ingrid Bergman as Elsa, and Bergman became the logical choice for the role after Ann Sheridan, Hedy Lamarr, Michelle Morgan were ruled out, and she had to be borrowed by David O. Selznick. And interestingly, Bergman always downplayed Casablanca. All this stuff, she never thought she was good looking. She watched the rushes and she said, "I look like a milkmaid," which is hard to believe. And she was always dismissive when people in the years would come back and rave about Casablanca, and she would say, well, you know, I made other pictures too. But along with Paul Henreid as Victor Laszlo, Claude Rains, Sidney Greenstreet, Peter Lorre, Dooley Wilson, Zakal, I think Casablanca may be the most well-cast movie ever made. There's a case to be made, because everyone in it is perfect. And of course, there is the music as time goes by. And it was repurposed by the great Max Steiner, legendary Warner Brothers house composer, who hated it because it was a song written for a Broadway play in 1931 by someone named Herbert Hupfeld. And Steiner felt that, well, you know, I'm the composer, I should write my own music. And he and Wallace went back and forth on this, and Wallace got his way. And it made for a memorable, memorable movie. Casablanca was finished 10 days over schedule because the writers kept churning out pages. It was a movie that everyone involved in tried to make better to the last possible instance. And to a degree, the script was being changed as they went along. Now, there's some claimants like Bergman, I think in her book, said, well, I didn't know if I was going to go away with Laszlo or Bogart or whatever. That may be her memory, but that's not exactly true. But no one really knew how the ending was going to be stitched together. And what they finally came up with was magic. When they previewed it, the crowd went absolutely crazy, and Hal Wallace wanted to do some changes to the ending. And Jack Warner sent him a memo and said, don't touch it, it's great. And Warner, for all the criticism that gets rightly heaped on some of the things he did with actors and his behavior and so forth, Jack Warner had a very good instinct on what would work in a film and what wouldn't work in a film. And reinforcing that, he rushed the premiere in Hollywood in November of '42, and that was just as American troops were prevailing in North Africa. And then he put it in general release in January of '43, right after the Casablanca conference between Roosevelt and Churchill. So Jack did know how to promote a movie. There is no doubt about that. The picture was nominated for 8 Academy Awards. It won 3, Best Writing for the Epsteins and Koch, Best Director for Mike Curtiz, and the big one for Best Picture. One footnote on this, the marriage between Hal Wallace and Jack Warner that spawned so many movies really ended with Casablanca because he got an independent production deal at Warner Brothers, and his successes and his ego grew with that, and Jack Warner had a kind of fine line over the perception of who ran the studio, which it was his studio. He would take people and go, whose name's on the water tower? So when they announced the Oscar and Wallace got up to get the Oscar, Warner ran up ahead of him and grabbed the Oscar from Jack Benny and wouldn't give it to Hal Wallace. And his time was marked. I think he left the studio about 2 months later. That was about it. And that straw broke the camel's back, and Wallace set up independent production company at Paramount. But Casablanca really represents the apex of the Hollywood studio system of Warner Brothers coming together at precisely the right time with the optimum acting talent, the directorial acumen of Curtiz, the production decisions, the perfectly matched writing, the music. It was kind of a confluence of almost predestined serendipity. And the great Andrew Sarris called it a happy accident. And I would prefer to term Casablanca as a movie that occurred accidentally on purpose. There's a timeless appeal to it, personified by Humphrey Bogart as Rick. I think for the movies, watching a story where you have someone doing the right thing with class never goes out of style. The ethical heft really elevates the movie from an acclaimed film to something very rare in our culture, a cultural pillar. I think Casablanca represented what was good during an era when the differences between good and evil were readily apparent. And I think it's a movie that still resonates, particularly during the present day. Patriotism based on personal standards instead of jingoistic flag waving. Honor without phoniness, toughness without cruelty, and vulnerability rather than weakness. And yes, love. And who doesn't think about love while watching Casablanca? It's a signpost, I think, of our history and our culture, because in the end, Casablanca is about the best of us. So with that, please enjoy the movie. Thanks for coming. I'll be back to intro Kid Galahad, but after this, I think this is going to be a fantastic series. I thank you all for coming, and with that, Casablanca. Thank you.